My name is Kiera Gallagher. I'm 28 years old. In the middle of a graduation party, with crystal chandeliers overhead and champagne flutes circulating through a crowd of 150 people, when my 82-year-old grandmother stood up mid-toast and announced to every business partner, every professor, and every carefully curated guest in that room that she was pressing charges against my father for stealing the $200,000 that legally, irrevocably belonged to me. The reason I had spent 6 years in the U.S. Army instead of a university campus, the reason I was still chipping away at student loans with combat pay while my younger sister Quinn vacationed in the south of France, all of it came down to a single conversation at our kitchen table when I was 18 years old, when my father, Curtis Gallagher, a man who managed other people's money for a living as a private equity executive, looked me in the eye and said, "You'll figure it out, Kiera. You always do." Then he took my entire $200,000 share of my grandfather's education trust and handed it to my sister. And then, to make absolutely certain I could never come back for what was mine, he sat at his mahogany desk and spent hours practicing my grandmother's handwriting until he could forge her signature well enough to pass a legal review. If you've ever been handed the role of the strong one, while someone else walked away with the full inheritance, drop a comment right now and let me know where you're watching from, because I read every single one. And if this story already has your attention, go ahead and hit a like. It takes 2 seconds and it helps more than you know. Now let me take you back. The architecture of favoritism in the Gallagher household was something you couldn't point to in a single moment. It was the kind of slow, layered construction that only reveals its full shape when you're standing far enough away to see the whole building. It began when I was 12 years old and Quinn was 9, in the middle of a July that felt like it was trying to steam the state of Connecticut off the map, standing in the kitchen of our Greenwich home while the central air conditioner hummed its expensive, reliable song. I had brought home my report card, straight A's as usual, and I set it on the counter where my mother, Diane, was folding linen napkins for one of her charity brunches, and she glanced at it the way you'd glance at a receipt for a transaction you already expected to go through. "Good job," she said, her eyes already drifting back to the napkins. "We knew you could do it." That was the full extent of the celebration. 7 words that landed less like praise and more like an invoice being filed away. The following week, Quinn came home with a B+ in math, and the reaction in that house was something you would have expected to follow a moon landing. My father, Curtis, made a reservation at the upscale Italian bistro downtown that we only visited on genuinely special occasions. And over dinner, he ruffled Quinn's hair while a waiter brought out a celebratory molten lava cake, and he said, with warmth I had never heard directed at me, "We are so proud of you for working hard." I sat across the table pushing pasta around my plate, trying to work out the logic of a universe where my best was invisible and my sister's acceptable was a cause for dessert. By the time I was 16, I had the pattern fully mapped. Being capable meant being invisible, and needing help was the only thing in our household that reliably generated attention and care. In the ecosystem of the Gallagher home, Quinn was the rare orchid that required constant climate control and specialized soil. And I was the oak tree everyone expected to survive every season without a single drop of water. When Quinn struggled with her homework, my parents hired tutors from Yale at $60 an hour. When she needed help crafting college application essays, they retained a high-end educational consultant to polish every sentence. When I needed help, with any of it, I researched scholarships alone at the local library until the janitors turned off the overhead lights and the building went dark around me. On my 16th birthday, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table and gave me not a celebration, but a lecture. A sober, measured conversation about the importance of financial responsibility and the virtue of self-reliance, delivered in the tone my father used at board meetings rather than at family dinners. 2 years later, Quinn turned 16, and she received a used Honda with a red ribbon on the hood, parked in the driveway like a small monument to the asymmetry that had defined my entire childhood. I was still walking 3 miles each way to the diner where I worked my part-time job, coming home with grease under my fingernails and the specific exhaustion that comes from earning every dollar you spend. My mother's explanation, when I finally asked why the rules felt so different, was delivered with the patient tone she reserved for explaining things she found too obvious to require justification. "Quinn needs more support," she said, watching me scrub my hands at the kitchen sink. "You're so mature for your age, Kiara. You understand, right?" I understood. I understood that needing help was the language that got a response in our house, and that being strong was just another way of saying you had been quietly disqualified from care. My Aunt Rachel Holt noticed long before I was willing to admit it out loud. She was my father's older sister, the kind of woman who wore her opinions like a sharp-edged blazer, deliberately chosen and unapologetically fitted, and she didn't moderate herself for anyone's comfort. At Thanksgiving one year, while the smell of roasted turkey and something unspoken hung over the dining room table, she looked at my father directly and told him, "Curtis, you are taking advantage of Kiara's independence. That girl is drowning in expectations, and you can't see it because she's too proud to ask for a life raft." My father sipped his Cabernet and said I was fine, I always was, and that was the end of that conversation, at least on the surface. I was 18 years old and 3 months from graduating high school when my future narrowed to a single conversation at the kitchen table. I had been accepted to UConn with a partial scholarship that covered tuition, but not room and board or books, and I had spent weeks calculating how the Gallagher Family Education Trust, the fund my grandfather had established specifically for his grandchildren's college educations, would bridge the gap. I had known about this trust for as long as I could remember, my father referencing it during the rare moments he spoke about our future in concrete terms, always framing it as the thing that would make sure both his daughters had a real and equal start in life. I sat down at the heavy kitchen table with my acceptance letter in hand, ready to talk logistics, and my parents exchanged a look before I had finished my first sentence. A quick, clinical glance that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin, the kind of look that compresses your stomach before a single word has been spoken. My mother, Diane, spoke first, her eyes fixed on a loose thread on her silk blouse rather than on my face. "We need to talk about the fund." I waited. "Quinn is going to need more support," my father said, and his voice had shifted into the register he used for executive decisions, flat, final, already closed to negotiation. "Her grades aren't where they need to be, and the private university she has set her heart on will require the full amount to give her the same opportunities you already have with your scholarship." The words didn't arrange themselves into meaning right away, and I sat there listening to them fall and trying to understand the shape of what they were building. "The full amount," I said slowly. My father nodded. "It's still family money," my mother added, her tone sharpening like a paper cut. "We're making the best decision for the family as a whole." I tried to explain that my grandfather had set it up for both of us, that the terms had always been clear, that this was not a discretionary decision to be made over breakfast. My father's palm came down lightly on the table, not a slam, but a period, a physical punctuation mark signaling that the discussion was over. "Your grandfather would want us to do what's right," he said. "You got the scholarship. You're resourceful, Kiara. Quinn needs this more than you do. She isn't built for the struggle the way you are." The betrayal had a flavor, copper, metallic, the specific taste of something precious being lost without ceremony. I asked, very quietly, if that meant I was getting nothing. My mother was already standing up, already moving toward the pantry to inventory the wine, already physically closing the chapter before I had finished processing it. "You'll figure it out, Kiara," she said without turning around. "You always do." Those 5 words followed me down the hallway to my bedroom, where I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and opened my laptop and typed "military education benefits" into the search bar, because I had just understood with complete clarity that if I wanted a future, I was going to have to build it myself. And the people who should have been my foundation had just confirmed in explicit terms that they were not. 3 months later, I was at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, in the suffocating, humid heat of a Midwestern summer, my hair buzzed short and my identity reduced to a name stenciled on a duffel bag, learning to disassemble a rifle in the dark while Quinn was posting orientation photos from her private university dorm, captions full of gratitude for parents who believed in her. The irony sat in my chest like a stone. Nobody in those photos mentioned that belief had a $400,000 price tag and that the invoice had been paid entirely in my name, while I was eating MREs in a barracks that smelled of industrial cleaner and shared exhaustion. Every time I had limited access to my phone during training, I scrolled past the curated gallery of the life I had been detoured from. Quinn at sorority rush in a dress that probably cost more than a month of my combat pay. Quinn studying abroad in the south of France. Quinn at formal dinners with new friends. All of it lit with the golden warmth of a life lived without friction. My parents' social media had become a dedicated archive of her milestones. I sent them updates from my side of the world, a photo of me finishing an obstacle course, a message about completing my first month of training, eventually a brief note telling them I was being deployed overseas. And the responses I received were short, sometimes delayed by days, and in the case of the deployment announcement, non-existent. I had told my father I was going overseas and received no reply at all. Not a word, not a single character. Aunt Rachel was different. She texted consistently, asked questions with enough detail to show she was genuinely listening, and wrote once to tell me that my grandmother, Eleanor, asked about me constantly, that she seemed worried in a way that went beyond ordinary concern. The mention of Eleanor surprised me, because I had assumed she was either disappointed in my choice to enlist or simply too distant from military life to know how to bridge the gap. I called her once from base in one of my rare pockets of free time, the canvas walls of the tent shifting in a wind from the east. She answered immediately, her voice precise and alert in a way that had nothing to do with age. "Grandma, it's Kiara. Just wanted to check in." The pause that followed was long enough to feel intentional. "Are you all right, sweetheart? Really all right?" I told her I was fine, that it was hard, but I was managing. Another pause. "Your grandfather would be proud of your strength," she said quietly. "But strength shouldn't mean struggle. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I said I thought I did. Her voice had a quality I didn't have a name for. Cold, metallic. The clarity of someone who has been carrying a specific knowledge for a long time. "Some things aren't what they seem," she said, "including family decisions." The call ended before I could ask what she meant, and the static on the line mixed with the growing dissonance in my chest in a way I wouldn't fully understand for years. I spent 6 years earning what Quinn had been handed, working motor pool night shifts under fluorescent lights that buzzed like something was perpetually failing, paying off student loans dollar by dollar from a UConn degree I completed online between duty rotations, building a life from scratch in the hours between assignments. I came home with discharge papers, 4 months of savings, and the specific fatigue of a person who has been operating without a net for so long they've forgotten what solid ground feels like. The transition back to Greenwich was a collision of two different worlds moving at incompatible speeds, and I arrived at my parents' house to find my childhood bedroom partially converted into storage space for Quinn's off-season wardrobe, a renovated bathroom with heated marble floors and gold-plated fixtures, and a European sedan in the driveway that had been Quinn's graduation gift that spring. They had found money for all of it, for the careful aesthetics of a successful family, but not for a single care package in 6 years. The first family dinner was meant to be a homecoming, and within 20 minutes felt more like arriving uninvited at someone else's reunion. Before the appetizers were finished, my mother announced that Quinn was applying to MBA programs at Northwestern, Harvard, and Stanford, her eyes carrying the particular pride she used to direct at my report cards before I became the strong one. When the conversation turned to Quinn's GMAT score and her recommendations, all my father's professional contacts and golf partners, I tried to bridge the distance by mentioning I was exploring project management roles in the logistics sector, leveraging years of experience coordinating the movement of equipment and personnel across difficult terrain. My father nodded vaguely, his eyes already drifting back to the wine list. My mother said the military must have been quite an experience, and now I could settle down and find a real career, in the tone of someone closing a chapter they found slightly embarrassing. Quinn told me I seemed so different now, so intense. 6 years tends to do that, I said, and nobody asked anything else. I found the Veterans Support Group 3 weeks after coming home, because the honest truth was, I had nowhere else to go where silence wasn't treated as a symptom. That's where I met Jake Mercer. He was 30 years old, had served 8 years, and had the same slightly displaced quality I recognized in my own reflection every morning. The look of a person who has stood at the edge of something vast and come back to find the ordinary world unexpectedly difficult to navigate. He sat down next to me at the first meeting with coffee that tasted like the motor oil we used to drink on base, looked at the way I had positioned myself near the exit, and said, "First time?" And when I confirmed it, he smiled and said he had done the same exact thing. We started talking after meetings, then getting coffee between meetings at a diner on Route 1, where the neon sign had been flickering for what looked like a decade, and nobody cared about pedigree or postgraduate prestige. Jake understood things I didn't have to translate. The guilt of being home, the way a grocery store aisle with 30 kinds of cereal could feel genuinely overwhelming, the difficulty of re-entering a world where the stakes seemed both trivial and impossibly complex compared to the binary reality of the field. 6 weeks after we met, sitting on the tailgate of his truck while the sun dropped below the Connecticut ridgeline, he asked me why I had joined the military. I had never told anyone the complete version. With Jake, it came out without effort. The trust fund, the kitchen table conversation, the 5 words, the 6 years of watching Quinn live the life I had partly funded without ever knowing it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his jaw set, crushing his paper cup in one slow, deliberate grip. I want to pause here and ask, Has anyone ever asked you one single question that made you realize you had been building your entire understanding of your own life on top of a lie? Drop your story in the comments below because I genuinely want to hear it. And if you're still with me, please hit a like. It means the world. Now let's get back to where we left off. "Can I ask you something?" he finally said. I told him yes. "Did your grandmother actually agree to give all the money to Quinn? Did she tell you that herself? Or did your parents tell you that she did?" The question arrived like a physical impact, the kind that doesn't hurt immediately, but rearranges something structural beneath the surface. I had spent a decade operating on the assumption that my parents' account and my grandmother's actual position were the same thing, because I had never thought to separate them. Because separating them would have required confronting something I wasn't ready to look at directly. "My parents said it was a family decision," I said. Jake held my gaze with an intensity that stripped away every defense I had constructed around that memory. "That's not what I asked," he said. That night, driving home with the question suspended in the car around me, I thought about Eleanor's cryptic call from years ago, the cold, metallic edge in her voice when she said, "Some things aren't what they seem." And something in my chest that had been sealed for a decade shifted on its axis. "People who tell you you're so strong all the time," Jake had said before I left, "are usually using it as an excuse to stop supporting you. Strength doesn't mean you don't deserve help. It means you've learned to survive without it. But survival was never supposed to be the baseline for a daughter." Nobody had ever said that to me before. Not once in 28 years. The notification came to the family group chat on a Tuesday morning. "Quinn. Big news! I got into Northwestern's MBA program." My mother responded within seconds, a stream of pride and promises to celebrate. My father wrote, "That's our girl. Of course we'll help with tuition." I sat with the phone in my hand, the familiar heat flaring in my gut. Not at Quinn's acceptance, which she had genuinely earned, but at those 5 words, "Of course we'll help." Words that had never once been arranged in my direction. I typed my congratulations and meant them sincerely. Then my mother wrote that the program ran $120,000 over 2 years, but was such a worthwhile investment in Quinn's future. And something in me reached a point of cold, absolute precision that felt less like anger and more like a calculation completing itself. I typed, "Where is that money coming from? I'm still paying off my student loans." The typing indicators appeared and disappeared several times before my father responded. "Your military benefits covered your degree. Quinn's education requires a different level of support. This is an investment." The word investment felt like being deliberately struck with something familiar. I wrote back that my benefits had covered a UConn degree completed online between duty rotations, while Quinn had received a full private university experience and was now being offered a $120,000 MBA, both drawing from a fund that had been legally intended for both of us equally. My mother's response? "Here we go again. When will you stop being bitter?" And Quinn, "Seriously, Kiara, you're ruining my moment. This is exactly why Mom and Dad focus on me. I don't make everything about drama." I read Quinn's message 3 times, and the heat receded and was replaced by something colder and more deliberate. The kind of operational clarity I had learned in circumstances where emotion was a liability and precision was survival. I scrolled to Rachel Holt's contact, and she answered on the second ring. "I need Eleanor's direct number," I said, my voice carrying the flat, focused register of someone calling in coordinates. And I need to know exactly how the Gallagher Family Education Trust was structured. There was a pause, and then I heard Rachel exhale, a long, slow release that sounded like relief that had been compressed for years. "It's about time, Kiara," she said. "The truth has been waiting for you to come home for it." I called Eleanor that evening from the back porch, the early autumn Connecticut air biting at my skin, the sound of crickets in the manicured lawn feeling less like peace and more like a countdown. She answered on the first ring, alert and expectant, as if she had been sitting in perfect stillness for a very long time, waiting for this specific call. I told her I needed to ask about the college fund. She said she had been waiting for this conversation for 10 years. I laid out what my parents had told me, that it was family money, that she had agreed to give it all to Quinn because Quinn needed it more, that it had been her wish that I be the strong one, who didn't require the same level of support. The silence that followed was long and geological. "They told you I agreed?" Her voice dropped the warmth entirely, replacing it with a quality I can only describe as granite, the sound of a woman who has been patient for a decade and has arrived at the precise end of patience. "Yes," I said. "They said it was a family decision." "That is a lie." The words were clean and surgical. "Your grandfather and I established that trust with explicit legal instructions. $200,000 for each grandchild, distributed at 18 for educational purposes, equal distribution, non-negotiable. Not a suggestion for your father to reinterpret according to his preferences, but a binding legal mandate." I felt the deck beneath me shift, the solid board suddenly behaving like something that couldn't be trusted. She continued, her voice steady in the way of someone who has rehearsed an accounting they hope to never have to give. She told me she had not interfered immediately because she had believed they would do the right thing, that they would see what they were doing to me and correct it on their own, before it became permanent and irreversible. She told me she had been wrong to wait that long. "I should have acted years ago," she said. "When I watched you walk to that Army recruitment station in Fort Leonard Wood, while Quinn was being driven to orientation at her private university." "Are you saying they just took my money?" I asked, and the question came out smaller than I intended, stripped of every armor I had built around it. "I'm saying your father, as trustee of that fund, violated every term of the legal document he was charged with protecting and treated a binding legal instrument like a personal checking account. I've already been in contact with Warren Nash, your grandfather's estate attorney, and he has been investigating the paper trail from the month you turned 18. Warren Nash's email arrived at 11 that night, the notification lighting up my dark room like a flare in the field. I opened it with my laptop balanced on my knees, Jake beside me on the small couch of his apartment, the smell of old leather and burnt coffee grounding the moment in something real and solid. The first attachment was the original trust document, dated 2 years before I was born, and the language was unambiguous to the point of being almost painful. $200,000 per grandchild, educational purposes, equal distribution, non-negotiable. The word equal underlined in Warren's margin notes in digital red. The second attachment was the withdrawal ledger. Starting the month I turned 18, money had been moved out of the trust in a steady, systematic current, all of it directed to accounts in Quinn's name or paid directly to her private university, covering luxury dormitory housing, meal plan upgrades, Greek life dues, and an entire semester abroad in the south of France. $400,000. 6 years of transfers. Every cent of what should have been split equally between 2 daughters had been concentrated into one life, leaving nothing. Not a single disbursement, not $100, not a gesture toward equity for the other. The third attachment made the room tilt. It was an amendment to the trust, dated 3 months after I turned 18, purportedly signed by my grandmother, authorizing flexible distribution at trustees' discretion. Warren's notation beneath it read, "Signature analysis completed by independent forensic examiner. This document is a forgery. Your grandmother's authenticated signature from the same period is attached for comparison. Note the differences in ink pressure, the hesitation in the flow, and the unnatural loop formations in the ascending letter forms." I zoomed in until both signatures filled my screen, and even to my untrained eye, the comparison was devastating in its clarity. My father had sat at his mahogany desk, possibly with a glass of scotch beside him, possibly on a Sunday afternoon when the house was quiet and the opportunity felt manageable, and practiced his own mother's handwriting until he could produce something that would hold up to casual inspection. And then he had used it to strip me of my legal inheritance and watched me go with the rehearsed expression of a man who had decided his justifications were sufficient. "Your father forged your grandmother's signature," Jake said, reading over my shoulder, his hand resting on my shoulder, with a weight that was the only thing keeping me fully anchored to the room. "That's fraud," I said, and the words sat in my mouth like something that had no business existing in a sentence about my own father. I need to stop here for a moment, because staring at that forged document, knowing my own father had done this, was one of the most surreal and shattering experiences of my entire life. If you think what he did was wrong, show it with a like, and make sure you're subscribed so you're here when I tell you exactly what happened next. Now, let's get back to the story. Warren's final paragraph laid out the legal exposure in terms that left nothing to interpretation: embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty, forgery, multiple felonies under Connecticut law. A text from Warren followed minutes later. The question isn't whether you have a case, it's whether you're prepared to pursue it. Your grandmother and I are ready to initiate legal proceedings the moment you give the word. I looked at Jake. He squeezed my hand once, firm and brief. "They didn't just choose Quinn over you," he said. "They committed crimes to guarantee you stayed at the bottom while she rose." There is a significant difference between unfair parenting and deliberate fraud, and what those documents describe is unambiguously the second one. I didn't sleep. I watched the sky transition from navy to gray to the pale, colorless light that precedes sunrise, with the printed documents sitting on the nightstand like a loaded weapon waiting for someone to make a decision about it. I drove to Greenwich the next morning, the suburban streets still wrapped in morning mist, the stone walls and oversized mailboxes presenting their usual face of prosperous indifference. My father answered the door in a cashmere sweater and khaki slacks, the portrait of a man who had managed his image for so long he wore it in his own home on a Saturday morning. His smile collapsed when he registered my expression. I walked past him into the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had been dismissed at 18 with 5 words that redirected the entire trajectory of my life. And I set the documents on the granite counter without preamble. "Explain this," I said. He picked up the first page, and the color left his face in a single, visible withdrawal, like a tide going out faster than it should. "You forged her signature, Curtis. You stole my share of the trust to fund a lifestyle for Quinn that we could not otherwise have afforded. And you sent me to serve overseas with nothing and called it family values and my own strength. It's not that simple, Kiara. Yes, it is. $200,000 for me. $200,000 for Quinn. You took it all. You forged a document to legalize it, and then you spent a decade standing in front of me using my own resilience as the justification. My mother appeared in the doorway, clutching a silk robe around her, her eyes darting between the documents and my father's trembling hands. When she understood what she was looking at, her response was not remorse, but defensive velocity. Your father did what he had to. Quinn wouldn't have made it without full support. She doesn't have your toughness. I told her that if Quinn needed more help, they should have asked Eleanor to adjust the trust terms legally, with transparency, through proper channels, not stolen from the daughter who was out there earning her own way while they signed documents in her name. My father's voice cracked when he offered to pay me back privately, invoking Quinn's career at Northwestern, invoking the investors and business partners who would be at her graduation party, invoking the optics of everything he had spent decades constructing. I thought about every night shift in the motor pool. I thought about the student loans I was still carrying. I thought about 6 years of documented silence from a family group chat that had found time and energy to document every milestone of Quinn's charmed educational journey. Now you think about the consequences, I said, and they picked up the documents and moved toward the door. And when my father called after me, when he said Quinn was graduating next month, that they had important people coming, that I could still protect everyone from the fallout, I stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. I'm not ruining anything, I said. The truth will do that all by itself. The Lakewood Country Club in Greenwich was exactly the kind of venue my parents would select to frame their final performance. The kind of place where the smell of aged wood and expensive liquor creates the impression that the people inside have always been exactly who they present themselves to be. The ballroom was already full when Jake and I arrived, 150 guests at minimum. The ceiling hung with crystal chandeliers throwing light across silver platters of oysters and circulating champagne flutes with the democratic grace of money that has never questioned its own legitimacy. Quinn's MBA cohort was there in full strength. Young professionals from Northwestern, professors with the careful eyes of people trained to distinguish between achievement and presentation. And my parents' business partners, men whose expensive watches caught the chandelier light like quiet signals of arrival. Banners declared congratulations in elegant script. A table near the entrance displayed a curated visual timeline of Quinn's journey. Sorority photographs, study abroad pictures from the south of France, her undergraduate graduation ceremony. It was a complete visual autobiography of a life funded by money that was never legally my father's to give. My mother materialized before I had taken 20 steps into the room, her smile calibrated to the precise frequency of social management. You came. Thank you. Please just smile and be happy for your sister today. Quinn appeared in the navy designer dress, polished in the way of someone who has practiced belonging until it became automatic. And when she saw me, something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly, but the sharp, localized anxiety of a person who knows something in the structure of the evening is not sound. Glad you could make it, she said. Try not to make it awkward. This is a critical networking day for my career. I gave short, polite answers to the relatives who descended. Aunts and uncles who hadn't seen me since before Fort Leonard Wood, who asked about my service with the surface-level curiosity of people who wanted to acknowledge the fact without engaging with its reality, who treated 6 years of military service like an interesting gap year that had run longer than expected. My father hovered near the bar with a gin and tonic gripped too tightly, watching me with the specific anxiety of a man waiting for something he knows is coming and cannot stop. Then Eleanor Gallagher entered the room. She moved through the crowd with the gravity of a woman who has outlived every version of herself that was ever afraid of consequences. Wearing a burgundy silk dress and the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandfather. Beside her walked Warren Nash, carrying a leather briefcase with the quiet authority of a man who has done this kind of thing before and knows exactly how it unfolds. Rachel appeared at my elbow, eyes carrying a dangerous anticipation. "Your grandmother looks like a woman who has made a specific decision," she said. Eleanor caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, deliberate nod. The kind of signal exchanged in the moment before something irrevocable begins. My father tapped a microphone at the front of the room, and through the feedback screech and the subsequent settling of attention, he began to speak with the warm, polished confidence of a man who has never been publicly held accountable for anything. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about making tough choices and prioritizing wisely and investing in Quinn's future with everything they had. He said not every parent would go this far, but that they had believed in her potential from the beginning and done whatever it took to nurture it. The room murmured with the approving warmth of people receiving a story that confirms what they prefer to believe. My father raised his glass. "Some people said we gave Quinn too much support. I say we gave her exactly what she needed to succeed. And now we get to watch her soar." I sat perfectly still and watched my father reframe fraud as wisdom and theft as sacrifice, delivered with the fluency of someone who had been practicing the performance for a decade. And the hypocrisy was dense enough to have texture, and that texture tasted like the copper I had first noticed in my mouth at a kitchen table 10 years ago. That's when Eleanor stood up. The room went quiet again, but the quality of this silence was different. The way a room goes quiet when something with real structural weight enters it. "Before we toast," she said, her voice carrying the way a bell carries in a space built for acoustics, "I'd like to say something." My father's smile went motionless. "Mom, this isn't the time." "I think it is, Curtis. You just gave a lovely speech about sacrifices and investments. Let's talk about what was actually sacrificed, and by whom, and with whose money." She walked toward the front of the room with the deliberate calm of someone who has been waiting a decade for this particular moment and refuses to rush it now that it has arrived. And Warren Nash followed with his briefcase open, beginning to distribute folders to the key tables, the professors, the extended family, my parents' business partners. And people opened them with the polite curiosity of party guests who did not yet understand they were holding legal documentation. "The fund your father just described was established by my late husband and me 28 years ago. $400,000 total. $200,000 for Kiara and $200,000 for Quinn. Equal distribution, non-negotiable, written into a binding legal trust that your father was appointed to administer." She paused while the folders rustled through the room, the sound of 150 people beginning to read. Kiara received 0. While Quinn was in her private university dorm and then studying abroad in Europe on meal plans and sorority dues, Kiara was enlisted in the United States Army, which she joined because her father told her to figure it out. On the same day, he took every penny that was legally and irrevocably hers. She looked at me across the room, and I held her gaze without moving. "And when I became aware of what had happened and began asking questions, your father did not correct the record. He amended the trust with my signature, a signature I never gave, a signature he forged." The sound that moved through the room was the collective, involuntary intake of breath that happens when a crowd processes the same piece of information simultaneously. And in that sound, I could hear the precise beginning of something that would not stop. The sound of a reputation losing its structural integrity in real time. Quinn's voice came from somewhere to my left, thin and beginning to fracture. "Dad?" My father's mouth opened and produced nothing, the expression of a man who has run out of prepared material. One of Quinn's professors, a woman with gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to institutional accountability, leaned over the documents with an expression moving rapidly from confusion to gravity. "Quinn, is this accurate? Your educational funding came from a misappropriated trust?" Quinn's answer was immediate. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." But the professor's face had already arranged itself into the expression of someone calculating the institutional consequences of what she was holding. "This will require review by the school's ethics board. Funding sources are a matter of academic integrity." Warren Nash stepped forward, his voice trained for exactly this kind of room. "The documents you're holding show 6 years of illegal withdrawals from a legally established educational trust. The full $400,000 was directed exclusively to Quinn's accounts or paid directly to her educational institutions. Under Connecticut law, this constitutes embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. Additionally, forensic signature analysis confirms the trust amendment was a forgery." My mother shot to her feet. "You are all overreacting. This is a private family matter." But the room was no longer treating it that way, and the social fabric was tearing along lines that had always been there, invisible until now. Whispers moved through the guests with the speed of wildfire finding dry ground. "He forged his own mother's signature. That girl served 6 years while her sister lived like that." He stood up there and called it sacrifice. Quinn turned toward me, mascara beginning its slow descent. "Kiara, you did this! You ruined my day!" I looked at her with the steadiness of a person who has been in situations where composure is not optional. "I didn't do anything," I said. "The truth did." Warren produced a second document from his briefcase. "During our investigation, we identified additional irregularities. A separate educational trust established by Kiara and Quinn's paternal grandfather, $50,000 per grandchild, was also systematically liquidated, with the full amount directed exclusively to Quinn's accounts. Different account structures, identical pattern of misappropriation." Rachel stood from her seat, her voice level and precise. "Curtis, you stole from 2 separate trusts your own family built for both daughters. You robbed one to fund a fantasy for the other, and then you stood in this room and called it parenting." My father was openly crying now, the tears arriving with the completeness of a man whose performance has finally exhausted the last of its fuel. And he said he had just wanted Quinn to have every advantage, that he had planned to pay me back eventually, that he had his reasons. Eleanor's voice was quiet, but carried the full weight of a decade's withheld judgment. "You had 10 years, Curtis. You renovated your bathroom instead. You bought a new car. You signed forged documents at your mahogany desk while your other daughter was in a foxhole." Warren added, without inflection, "Our investigation also identified withdrawals used to service personal debts, credit card balances, home renovation expenses entirely unrelated to education. The misappropriation was not limited to Quinn's benefit. Trust funds were used to maintain the family's social position. The implication moved through the room like a slow, cold tide, and I watched my parents' guests recalibrate in real time. The understanding shifting from preferential parenting to active, premeditated financial crime sustained for over a decade and executed against a daughter who had been sent into military service as an indirect consequence of it. Quinn's consulting firm supervisor rose from her table and gestured for Quinn to follow her out of the room. The professional network Quinn had spent the entire afternoon carefully assembling was beginning to dissolve. One guest stood and walked quietly toward the exit. Then another. The country club manager appeared at my mother's elbow and spoke in a low, firm tone about settling the bill immediately. And my mother's hands shook as she reached for a card she already knew might not clear. I want to pause here and ask everyone, do you think justice was fully served that night? Or did things go further than they needed to? Leave your honest answer in the comments because I genuinely want to know. And if the story has moved you, please hit a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Now, let's get back to how this all ended. The gravel of the Lakewood Country Club parking lot was the only sound as Jake and I walked out into the night air, each step deliberate and grounding, like something being formally closed. I had said everything I needed to say, and I had done it without theatrics, without anger, without anything except the quiet authority of a person who finally stopped absorbing the cost of other people's choices. As we pulled away, I could see Eleanor in the warmly lit entrance of the ballroom, her burgundy silhouette standing perfectly straight, moving toward my father with the deliberate calm of a woman who has been patient for a decade and is now settling a long outstanding account. 2 weeks later, Rachel forwarded me the email confirming that Quinn's consulting firm had formally rescinded her offer. The language was careful and corporate polite. Reputational risk, financial integrity vetting requirements, but the message was permanent in the tight-knit professional circles of Connecticut finance, where the folders Warren had distributed now existed as a matter of record. I sat with the screen open and felt something complicated twist through me, a mixture of vindication and a genuine, unavoidable sadness for the sister I had spent years resenting and was only now beginning to understand clearly. Jake found me on the couch. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. "Sad," I said. "She worked hard for that MBA, even if the funding was fraudulent. I wanted accountability. I didn't want total destruction." "Those aren't always separable," he said. "Actions have consequences that don't stop at the person who deserved them most. Your father pulled the trigger on her career the day he signed that forged document." 3 months after the party, I stood in a conference room in Bridgeport while Warren Nash walked me through the settlement terms my father had agreed to. He had pleaded guilty to reduced charges, embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty, in exchange for full cooperation and complete restitution, with the forgery counts dropped and jail time replaced by probation. The terms were stark on paper. $250,000 principal plus accumulated interest totaling approximately $280,000, paid over 10 years at $2,800 per month, 2 years of probation, mandatory family financial counseling, and permanent removal as trustee from any family trust, legal or otherwise, in perpetuity. Warren pointed to the final clause with something that might have been quiet satisfaction. "He can never hold a position of financial authority in this family again. He has been legally stripped of the power he misused. I signed my name, and the pen stroke felt like a final, clean line drawn beneath something that had been bleeding open for a decade. My father had to refinance the family home to make the initial down payment and liquidate a substantial portion of his retirement account. The investment he had made in Quinn's curated image of success now being systematically reclaimed from his own future. The first restitution payment arrived in my account 3 weeks after the settlement was signed, and I transferred it immediately to an investment account and did not touch it for living expenses, did not celebrate with it, did not spend a single dollar of it on anything that felt like relief. "What are you going to do with it?" Jake asked one evening. "Rebuild what they stole," I said. "Pay off my loans, put a down payment on a place, and build something that actually matters." He asked if I wasn't going to treat myself at all. I thought about it. Maybe once it feels like mine instead of just returned property. Right now it feels like justice, and justice is rarely comfortable. 6 months after the party, Quinn texted me. 3 words. "Can we talk?" And then, "I understand if you say no." I typed back, "Coffee, public place, Saturday at 2. She arrived early, sitting at a corner table of the Route 1 diner where Jake and I used to decompress after group meetings, and she looked genuinely different. The private university polish replaced by something more human and tired. Her hair pulled back simply, wearing jeans, the specific appearance of a person who has stopped investing energy in performance. "I'm not here to make excuses," she said. "I need to say I'm sorry." I waited, giving the silence its full weight. She told me she had found a position at a smaller consulting firm that knew the full story and had hired her anyway on the strength of her honesty. She had been in therapy. She was beginning to understand how much she had taken for granted, how much she had allowed my strength to function as a shield for her own unwillingness to ask uncomfortable questions. "I didn't know about the fraud," she said, "but I didn't ask questions either, because I didn't want to know if something was wrong, because knowing would have required facing it. I was a willing participant in your invisibility." That landed with an honesty I hadn't expected, and I let it sit between us without rushing to resolve it. She slid a piece of paper across the table, a self-generated payment plan, $500 per month from her own salary, not court-ordered, not required by any settlement, just decided. "Half of that money should have been yours, so I'm giving you half of what I'm earning now." I looked at the paper and then at my sister, who looked, for the first time in my memory, like someone I could actually know. "Things won't go back to how they were," I said. "I know," she replied. "I'm just asking for the chance to be better. Eventually." The first Thanksgiving after everything happened, I spent at Jake's family home in the Pennsylvania hills, a house that felt warm in the way warm is supposed to feel, loud with the comfortable chaos of people who have chosen to be there, his mother making room at the table without asking a single question about my service record or my family history. My mother texted during dessert, "You're really not coming. It's Thanksgiving. We're still a family." I typed back that I needed space, and I meant it. My father sent a separate email that same evening, and unlike my mother's guilt-laden message, his was different in a way I hadn't expected. Specific, structured, the evident work of a man who had been told by his therapist to name the exact things he had done rather than offer shapeless remorse. He wrote that he had stolen from me, that he had forged documents, that he had let me believe I was not worth supporting, that he had built a hierarchy in his own family and called it love. He wrote that he knew he could not undo it, but was working to become someone I might eventually choose to trust. I read it 3 times. "Thank you for this," I wrote back. "It's a start." With the restitution payments arriving steadily each month, I made the first financial decisions of my adult life that were not driven by desperation. I paid off every student loan, $23,000 cleared in a single digital transaction, the relief arriving the way relief arrives when you've been carrying weight long enough to forget it was there. Physical, sudden, and complete. I put a down payment on a small condo with a view of the Long Island Sound, a place where every square foot belonged to no one else's narrative, earned and documented and irrevocably mine. And 3 months later, I filed the paperwork for the Gallagher Education Initiative, named after my grandfather, who had built the original trust because he believed his grandchildren deserved a real start in life, a belief that had survived my father's betrayal and arrived intact in a different form. The initiative's first session opened with 12 veterans seated in a circle in a community center room that smelled of old carpet and fresh coffee, and the program was built around the exact transition nobody prepared you for: the invisible years between service and civilian life, when the skills you built don't translate into language the corporate world recognizes, and the discipline you developed feels out of place in every carpeted office. At the first meeting, a woman in her early 30s started crying when we reached the portion of the discussion about feeling invisible after coming home, about doing something that mattered and returning to a world that couldn't see it. "That's exactly how I felt," she said. "Like I had given everything and nobody bothered to look." "I know," I said. "I've been there. But you are not invisible here." Eleanor came to the second meeting, sitting quietly near the back of the room with the expression of someone watching a long-held hope become a physical reality. When the session ended, she found me near the door and took both my hands in hers with a grip that was still strong and still precise and still entirely herself. "Your grandfather would be so proud of what you've built from this," she said, her voice carrying the particular warmth of a remark that has been prepared for a long time and is finally being delivered to the right person. "You turned a theft into a legacy." I told her I had learned it from watching her: how to hold your ground, how to wait for the right moment, how to act without performance when the moment arrives. She shook her head gently. "You learned it yourself, Kiara. We just gave you the coordinates." 18 months after the truth arrived in that ballroom and rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own history, I can finally see the shape of the whole picture. Not just the parts of it I was living through one at a time, but the full architecture of what was built in that house and what it cost me and what I have done with the wreckage. I wasted years measuring my worth against the silence of people who had an investment in keeping me silent, and I mistook the absence of complaint for peace. And what I had actually been doing for a decade was absorbing the full financial and emotional cost of their choices and calling it my own strength. Because that was the story they needed me to tell, and I had been telling it so long, I forgot it wasn't mine. The hardest lesson has been this: the people who love you are still capable of causing you the deepest damage, and that is precisely when boundaries matter most. Not as punishment, not as performance, but as the most direct and honest act of self-preservation available to you. I didn't ruin Quinn's party. I didn't ruin anything. The truth surfaced because it was the only thing in that room with the structural integrity to hold its own weight, and everything that couldn't survive its arrival was never solid to begin with. My relationship with my father is rebuilding on different and explicit terms: coffee once a month, honest conversations, no pretense of returning to what we were before. My mother is slower to accountability, and our relationship remains carefully limited, and I have accepted that I cannot force a reckoning on someone who has not yet decided to stand in it. Quinn and I are building something new and cautious and unfamiliar, something without a name yet, but made of honesty rather than obligation, which is already more than we ever had. The Gallagher Education Initiative is in its second year, working with 50 veterans this cycle, and the money that was stolen from me is now funding scholarships and mentorship for people who served their country and came home to find the civilian world had not saved them a seat. That is the most valuable thing that $200,000 could ever have become. More valuable than sorority dues, more valuable than a study abroad semester, more valuable than the granite countertops and European sedan that were purchased with what remained. It became a door that stays open for people the way no door was ever left open for me. If this story helped you see that you are allowed to protect yourself, even from people who say they love you, especially from people who say they love you, then every word of it was worth saying. Check the description for resources on family financial abuse and establishing boundaries with toxic family dynamics. And remember this: the fact that you are still standing after everything they put you through is not proof that you didn't need help. It is proof of what you survived without it. Those are not the same thing, and you deserve to know the difference. Before I go, if this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone who deserved better than "you'll figure it out," please share it with them. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can give someone is the confirmation that what happened to them was real and it was wrong. Hit like, subscribe so you're here for the next chapter, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'll see you there.